Now, on top of that, you think about all the isms, right? You think about what people call microaggressions. There's another researcher who calls it symbolic violence, which I think that captures it better. Like, because it's not micro, it's not small, but it is a violence against our psyche, right? When you talk about
Mm-hmm.
microaggression, so you have all of those things that are happening, and how does that impact our health, right? We know there's more anxiety, all of those things that are happening, and that's global, right? As well.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the All Inclusive podcast. On today's episode, I'm joined by Latise Hairston, founder and chief impact officer at Hope Consulting. During the episode, we explore some of the challenging questions about the role of organisations in creating harm and doing good for marginalised communities. Latise offers her insights and perspectives on whether the harm caused by organisations outweighs their benefits, and the importance of creating meaningful change in DEI work despite ongoing pain and harm. As always, before jumping into the video, make sure to hit that subscribe button, turn on your notification bell, and follow on your favourite podcast platform so that you never miss an episode. That being said, let's jump in. Welcome, Latise.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I'm really excited to talk to you and have the opportunity. And thank you for the amazing work that you do already.
Oh no, and same to you also. Thanks so much for coming out and speaking with me today. Let's kick things off, I think, by telling our listeners a little bit more about you and your journey to where you are today.
Yeah, well, I've had an maybe a little bit of an unorthodox journey here. So I would say that I actually started off my career doing counseling and doing trauma work and doing work with communities that I would say have been pushed to the margins. One of the things that I saw in doing that work is the intersection of them with multiple organizations, particularly helping organizations that were supposed to be there to help and assist, and what was happening was they were being further oppressed by those same organizations. And so for me, it's really how I started my advocacy work. I started my advocacy work in my counseling and actually going with them to different appointments and meetings and preparing the families that I was working with how to navigate systems. And one of the things I've been working on this for actually quite a long time now. One of the things I was working on is a book around what happened to the human in human services. So that was just one aspect of my work, but it really led me into more so really thinking from that real social justice lens, right? And looking at how the organizations that we intersect with and the impact that it has in terms of ongoing oppression. So that led me to do that. Then I worked for a university for a number of years, actually going into organizations and working with organizations, being on the ground with them, doing coaching, so I could see what's happening. So I would be sometimes 6 months with organizations at a time, being in the meetings, which is a little bit different than, someone you just showing up, right, from time to time, versus really seeing what's happening. What's really the climate, the culture, what's happening within meetings, what's happening in terms of policies, practices, and procedures. Then I worked for a global hospitality company. Then I went and I was a global director of diversity, equity, inclusion in an organization as well. So had kind of I guess a windy road path into this work.
Yeah, no, but it does sound as though that it's been heavily to do with kind of helping others and really creating a change that is going to be allowing people to really thrive within the workplace. Um, for you, what does DEI mean to you?
Yeah, so for me, there's been really this evolution for me when I think about diversity, equity, inclusion, working with many different organizations, working with executive leaders in primarily, I would say, in executive coaching around people who identify as Black, Indigenous people of color. And one of the things I've been hearing, a lot of those individuals in DEI roles as well, and in other roles that were hired. And one of the things I've really been hearing is a lot in terms of the harm that's happening even within the roles. And it's very interesting because there's been a number of articles that have come out more recently in terms of with all the layoffs that are happening, that the roles of DEI directors, right, chief diversity officers, a lot of those roles are some of the first ones to go when all the after 2020, all the promises that happened in terms of DEI and organizations and what they were going to do. And you see, again, a lot of research that's saying a lot of that isn't actually happening. And so, going back to your question when you asked about, what does DEI mean to me? So, one for me right now, a focus of concentration I've been working on with many different organizations is around really shifting to healing centered practices. Right. And what I mean by that is that what's happening is there's harm that's happening sometimes in the name of DEI, where within organizations, they've made these promises, but you have people in the roles and they don't have the resources to do the job,
Right.
right?
Mm.
Right? They don't have the resources. And a lot of times they don't have the power to do the job. They're not empowered to do it in the way that is really needed. And so there's a lot of harm. There's a lot of responsibilities put on the role. Really not really looking at organization wide and everybody's responsibility in terms of carrying out that work, right? And so there's harm that's happening, and then there's healing that needs to happen. And again, there's a wonderful definition that I love from Dr. Sean Ginwright, who does a lot of work in this area. And he talks about healing is about the restoration of humanity, even in the face of fear. Because a lot of times what you'll hear, people's like, well, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to say. So even in the face of fear. So how do we heal while harm is still happening and while we're doing the work to change ways of being, policies, practices, procedures within organizations as well?
I love that. I do. I really love that. And for you, I mean, you've just said that it's something that you're working with a number of organizations on. What have you found to be a key step in really moving forward in kind of the healing and the hurt and the healing?
Yeah, there's actually a model that I use around healing center work organizations, but it's based on the work of many scholars before me. So, borrowing, right, and pulling it all together, but it's noticing in all the different levels, right, that we talk about on an individual level, on an interpersonal level, on an organizational level, community and cross structures, is actually noticing what are the ruptures that have happened, right? Across
Mm,
all those different ways, right? What are the ruptures that have happened in relationships? What are the ruptures that happen in terms of policies, practices, procedures within organizations and ways of being? And so being able to name it and being able to understand, right, as we're moving forward. But then after that, after looking at the ruptures, is also what is the repair that needs to happen in terms of the harm, right?
mm,
And then how do we restore? And so part of that, when we talk about restore, is that I also have this background in restorative practices, and restore not meaning going back to the way it was before, but but to be able to restore and repair the harm that it's done so that we can move into a future and even imagine futures where isms right, aren't there, right? Like,
Mm,
what does that look like? And
yeah.
being able to envision that, right? So we have to be able to do that first. And then how do we reconnect in a different way? So looking from an individual level, right, interpersonal level, from, an organizational level and across structure. So it's a very, I'll say it's slower, right? Because sometimes we're trying to move, 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 right? But really, really trying to understand at all levels and using various tools and practices to be able to do that.
Mm. What do you what do you think, or how do you think overall organizations are doing when it comes to DEI at the moment? Because I know that there's a lot of hurt that is going on. Do you feel that that's a like significant amount of organizations are doing that hurt, or what's your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, we're, I would say it, for me, I speak to the organizations that I've worked with, right? I speak to that as well as just in working with others who do this work as well. Um, and I think, you know, when we think about it, right? This country, or when I say this country, I'm talking about the US, but across when we all are suffering from the impacts of colonization, right? And all the other isms that take place across all over the world, globally as well. And so the thing when we're thinking about this is that this didn't happen overnight, right? And it's not going to change overnight, right? When
Right.
we think
Yeah.
about that.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's different organizations at different points, right?
Yeah. Mm.
I, working with some organizations and, I talk about and try to understand what's the organizations, they're at the place where it's about, the holidays, right? They're celebrating holidays, right? That's the work.
Mm-hmm.
When I say, what's the work that you're doing, right?
What have you done
And
so
that's where,
far? Oh, well, we had International
exactly,
Women's Day. We had an event.
right,
It's coming
exactly.
up to
We have a book
Ramadan.
club,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I get it. Mm-hmm.
Right. But on the other, and I also see organizations who are really looking at different kinds of practices and really looking at and examining, for example, what's our relationship with professionalism, right? What
Mm.
do we mean when we talk about what it means to be a professional and how does that live in our policies, practices, and procedures? And how does it produce differential outcomes for different people based on their various intersectional identities, right? And really digging into that, right? So, there are those who are looking again, they're doing climate surveys, but then there's also organizations that are really digging in to understand, well, what does that mean in terms of different units, different supervisors, different outcomes of different intersectional identities, right? So really digging in and really understanding. So I would say there's a range
Yeah.
when you think about it. And I would say the other thing is that really starting to look at, when we talk about, again, my background is also in psychology and counseling, things like that. And, when you talk about people having threat responses of fight, flight, freeze, right, dissociate, and appease, shows up at an organizational level as well when there is some discomfort and you have a group of people who voice a level of discomfort around the work of DEI, right? Um, and there's different responses in terms of an organization, in terms of what they experience as threat, right? And so some organizations will go into a freeze response and shut things down, right? And they'll
Mm-hmm.
say, oh no, we can't talk about this, we can't do this, right? We can't do that. So let's just focus on, you know it sometimes amounts to the whole piece of just like all lives matter, and not let's not talk about the
Yeah,
issues
very
that are
surface level. They
really
don't want to
surface.
go
Just
too far. Let's not go too far deep into this just in case. We'll kind of
yeah,
sugarcoat, cover it up with a band-aid. It should be
exactly.
fine. Yeah. No, I understand
It
what you
becomes
mean.
very performative in
Mm-hmm.
nature, right? But that's the other part of it, is that what's a little bit different about the work that I do is I also bring in somatic practices in, right? Going back to when we know what we know about the neuroscience of change, right? That sometimes we're trying to approach this work just from a cognitive dimension, when in reality, right, there's a whole disconnection from everything, like, just in so for example, someone in a training the other day was talking about brought up white supremacy culture, right? And we just stopped for a moment, and I'm like, we stop and we notice what happens within people's bodies even in hearing that kinds of language, and what comes up for them, right? So it's not just dealing with its cognitive dimension, but what are the fight, flight, freeze, appease, what are the responses to that? And then, because now we're starting to understand before the behavior comes, that we're reconnecting to what happens within us, right?
I'm curious, how do you measure that? How do you how do you gauge that? Because it's I mean it's very individual. So in someone kind of taking a step back and looking out into a classroom, how how do you know, right, okay, we've got these people that are in a freeze mode, or they're in an appease mode? I don't, like, I'm curious, how can we read that?
Yeah. So, I mean, part of it is even before we get into the work, right? I introduce somatic practices, right? And I kind of explain what it is, give some examples. Um, and then
We're going to take a minute to thank our friends at Dandi, the DEI analytics company, for supporting the show. To drive real change today, DEI leaders need to be strategic and they need to be data driven. That's why today's most successful DEI leaders use Dandi to measure and manage their DEI programs in real time, track key DEI metrics, and create reports at a push of a button. Are you ready to join the DEI measurement movement? Click the link in the description below to download your free essential guide to data driven DEI transformation.
And from as we so if you think about it this way, in terms of in psychology, when someone is like afraid of like a spider, and it's progressive exposure, right?
Right,
So they
yeah.
don't just bring the spider in and bring that in, but it's progressive exposure. So that's what happens throughout the and I don't call it training, really. I shouldn't have even said training, but it's an experience together, a
Mm-hmm.
collective experience, right? When we're thinking about it, is so it's kind of teaching and having people to start to identify, and even in breakout groups, and how you even process, like getting people accustomed to really paying attention, going
Mm-hmm.
back to what's happening with them. And for people who are less familiar with it, like, and people are more familiar with like emotional intelligence, right? So people
Okay.
are familiar with that, so you talk to them in terms of something they're akin to, right? Right.
Yes.
And so when you talk about emotional intelligence, right, it is about awareness and our responses, right? So in our
Mm-hmm.
ability to be able to respond from a place of that emotional intelligence, but being aware of ourselves.
Yeah.
So there's the connections and the links to what's familiar to people, right? And somatic practices again just means whole body, right? And not just coming from a cognitive place, when there really are a lot of emotional responses that happen, and other responses that happen that makes us like, ooh, move back from something, right? We might go into a freeze response, or we go
Yes.
into a fight response, right?
Yes.
And then you
Yeah.
get you get shame and blame, and all of those things that happen
No,
in
I
that way as well.
understand. Yeah, no, I understand.
Yeah.
I think it's a I guess it's about recognizing that there is that emotional element to a lot of this work. And
Yes,
as you said, it's really kind of recognizing that, and recognize it not only from a personal perspective for you as an individual, what are your responses, and then kind of trying to see, or just being aware that others may have different responses. And like you said, with the emotional intelligence, it's like knowing that there is a shift and responding to it accordingly, and making sure it's a part of anything new, or any change management that you put in place, that is kind of integrated into that. Because
yeah,
it's definitely, I mean, just in general, like, I feel like it's important that we understand that in order to really change a culture, or change anything really, it isn't going to just be a 1-2 and done. There's a lot of systemic and historical bad
that's right.
behaviors, and that have really ingrained the way in which the world operates and how we live. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done in order to kind of change that for the better. And like you said, it's not only just emotional, but it's definitely cognitive, and as well as emotional. Um,
Yeah. And I would also add to that, right, is also understanding really this piece around socialization, right? Right. I use a lot. I think it's, actually brilliant work. It's older, but the cycle of socialization, cycle of liberation, and really understanding and really, so for example, just taking one piece around socialization around professionalism, right? And what
mhm.
that means, and how we've been socialized from, from all the different systems, right? About what does it mean to be a professional. I was doing a
Yeah.
session the other day, and we were unpacking that, right?
It's a lot. Like,
And
even when I think about it as me
yeah,
personally, like, my idea of professionalism has changed dramatically, I think,
yes,
as I've gotten older. And I think initially I was taught through my parents and their generations, especially from I'm a person of color. It was like, you need to speak a certain type of way. I have to be dressed like in a suit, in kind of like office attire with tights, good black shoes, kind of shirts, skirt, blazer, that sort of dress. That, to me, if I looked like saw a woman walking down the road, I'd be like, right, okay, she's professional.
that's
Her
right.
hair tied back, neat and tidy. She's well put together. She's a professional. Whereas now I look at myself and I'm like, well, I go to work with my Converses on, a pair of jeans, and a jumper. Like, but I'm no less professional. Um,
That's right.
but yeah, so it's so interesting.
Noticing what that shift is, right? And then what, again, and this is the thing is, I also teach at a couple of universities, and we really unpack this, right? And we also look at historical policies and procedures that come out of HR, right? When you look at it,
Yeah,
and really looking at that, right? A lot of them were developed that we still have in place, right? And this is across the globe, right? We still have in place because they were put in place to exclude certain people and certain groups and at certain different times, and so they were exclusionary, and now we still have that socialization. So part of it is extracting and say, well, where did that come from, right? Even like you talked about, a piece of clothing has no meaning until we put the meaning on it. What does a tie in of itself? It's an article of clothing. You see what I'm saying?
yeah.
Right?
Mm,
You see what I'm saying? Until we start to put the meaning on it, and where does it come from? And then what does it mean in terms of who gets excluded and who gets included? Who are those who are making the rules, the norms, and then who gets pushed to the margins because of it? You understand what I'm saying? And
mm.
really, when we start to really look at that, it's it's slow work, but it comes from a place not of shame or blame, but being able to understand, understands ourselves. And it really is about going back to the definition of the healing is restoring our own humanity. And so it also comes to the other piece of centering is around compassion. And the compassion being is really first having self-compassion, right? Can we bring compassion to ourselves, you know, in terms of alleviating our own suffering? Because if we could do that first, and then we can have compassion for others. I mean, that's a big part of it as well. Yeah. So I mean, there's some other things that I'm really doing that and moving into as well. Is I looked at the research of I believe her name is Dana Johnson. And she's doing some research around rest inequality, right? And that's something that we don't necessarily talk about as much when we talk about this idea of rest inequality and really looking at, again, some of the same identities are pushed to the margins, have more rest inequality, right? And rest being the ability to not worry and have sustained peace, right? And then what does that mean for even how we show up at work, right? There was just an article in Harvard Business Review, and they talked about it's, it's not new, but it just brought it out again. This idea of they talk about micro stressors, right? And how these micro stressors are things like, for example, they give an example around you're working on a team and someone doesn't, get their stuff in on time, and so it impacts you, and now you're working late, and now you call your partner and say, I have to, and they're like, well, you don't come in, like all
Yeah.
these
Yeah. It's
stressors
like a
that happen.
snowball effect. Yeah.
Right,
Mm-hmm.
it's a
Mm-hmm.
snowball effect, and it has impact on our health. Now, on top of that, you think about all the isms, right? You think about what people call microaggressions. There's another researcher who calls it symbolic violence, which I think that captures it better. Like, because it's not micro, it's not small, but it is a violence against our psyche, right? When you talk about
Mm-hmm.
microaggression. So you have all of those things that are happening, and how does that impact our health, right? We know there's more anxiety, all of those things that are happening, and that's global, right? As well.
Mm, definitely. And there isn't, unfortunately, there isn't just a single thing that we need to do in order to change all of that. There's a lot of work to do. And how how would you say organizations can prioritize, like how would they prioritize any of the competing needs that a business has, or even within the DEI work that they have, or the goals that they've got, because there's a lot to do. What would you say is a way to kind of organize that? What do you do first?
I mean, the thing is, I think, I would say that's very unique to each organization when you're looking at that, right? When you're saying, because there's no one answer, right? When you're looking at it, I think, I think this is one of the things I would say is that when we're talking about DEI, um, often what happens is that you have if I'll just say this, if an organization has a chief diversity officer, and then if you look at some of those job descriptions in relationship to the chief diversity officer, they're supposed to, I say it's a miracle job description, right?
Yeah.
you know, you, when you see it as often pages of things that they're going to do, right? And sometimes they have timelines in regard to that. And I think really when we think about this, again, it's all of our responsibility. So how does that look across all systems? How does it look across all functions? in the organizations, and how is there accountability and relationship to that as well? It doesn't sit on somebody's shoulders to achieve that, right? Because one person, or even if you have a team, which often um in some organizations there isn't a team, right? To
Mm-hmm.
sometimes it's one person or two people, and the resources aren't there to support the work that match these statements, right? And so what does that really mean to really be able to look at? And so what does that mean across in terms of being the shouldering of every unit, right? Of every leader, of every, no matter where you're at in within the organization. And what does that look like in terms of accountability? Now, I think that's a broad stroke, right? And it's very different from different organizations as to where we begin or where we start, depending on where they're at in the journey when we
Mm-hmm.
start to look at that, right? Um, Sometimes there's magic wand thinking. I think that happens, right? That, you know, and you mentioned this before, which is, I think, so important without a change management strategy,
Yeah.
right? There's no parallel change management strategy.
Mm.
And change management is the people side of change,
Mm-hmm.
right? So there's these broad strategic plans. Some people are moving toward emergent strategy as well, without the other piece around the people side of change, right? And what does that look like,
Yeah.
right? Um,
And
and
I guess that
so,
ties back into what we were saying earlier in this conversation about the emotional side, people's reactions. I think it's
yes,
all a mix that plays a huge part, and it's
yes.
definitely an integral piece to this massive puzzle that we're trying to kind of put together.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's so important. And that's a lot of work that I'm also doing, with organizations around, yeah, the people side of change and what are the resources that you're putting together in terms of, and it's a whole process when you're talking about the people side of change and strategizing and having voices, right? And then what does that look like? So this is the other thing, right? Um, you know, again, when we're talking about, you know, no matter what the language that people use, if you're talking about belonging or you're talking about inclusion and you're talking about, again, there's different language that we use. Some people use justice and equity and all of those things when you think. So the thing is, for me, is when we're talking about, you know, what does that look like every day? Right? What does it look like to be inclusive, right? Every day. What does it look like in meetings, right? How does that show up? What are the specific behaviors, right? In terms of that. One of the things that I do is within organizations is we do something called or teach something called Sawabona agreements. So Sawabona comes from the Zulu greeting, which means we see you. And it's like the hello. And then the
Mm-hmm.
response back to that is I exist for you. And so if we're talking about belonging and inclusion is also very personal for individuals and teams, right? And so it's agreements around how might you be seen today, right? And how
Yeah.
might we exist for each other even at that team level, right? And so doing those agreements and having check-ins in relationship that how do we do to what we say we we need and what we're willing to offer to each other, right? So there's sometimes the big goals we want so many of these people or so many of these people within the organization, and when they come in they're harmed because the culture,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah,
Right,
it's just
right, want them
it's not
to
set
fit
up for
in.
them. Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Oh, Latise, I've so much enjoyed our conversation. I think you've given us a lot to think about, and a lot to really explore there today. Just before you leave us, Could you give some parting piece of advice for leaders that are aspiring to do this work and wanting to be advocates in the space?
Yeah, so the first thing I would say, and this is me speaking to me always as well first, right? Is about the importance of doing your own work. That's the thing. I think as a leader, when you're talking about what really, and when I say doing your own work, it really is being able to understand who you are, how you've been socialized, right? To be able to understand and be in this and let me just say this, it's beyond reading a book, right? So it's, because when I say about doing the work, sometimes people will say, well, yeah, I read this book, and what does that look like in action? Right? What is that?
Yeah.
What's the fruit of that? What is the
Mm-hmm.
fruit of, right, doing your own work? And so for me, I'm always in the process of doing my own work, but also having, I'm also surround myself with other individuals who also hold me accountable, but also who can support me, right? In the work as well, right? Because it's difficult. It's hard. It's hard and it's joyful, right? Like for example, in an experience was part of the other day, and someone just saying, you know, and really having tears in their eyes and being able to say, and they said, this is the first time being part of an organization, right? Where even being able in this space to be able to say what's harming and what I need, and actually feeling like someone is not only going to listen and say, oh, right,
Yeah,
but
they're
that there's
actually going to do
some
something.
actions are good.
Mm-hmm.
Something's going to happen as a result. Not that I'm just sharing so people can be voyeurs into my pain or my hurt, right? You know what I mean? That they actually see something, and they also recognize it's it was a small step, but it was meaningful, and that felt like part of that repairing, that reconnection, right, in a different way, right? And so I think that's something, and to be as leaders, to be able to understand what's our own threat response, right? When we feel, right, do we run away, right, from what is difficult or hard? So, yeah.
Oh, thank you, Latise. That's amazing. Um, Once again, thanks so much for joining me today on this podcast. For anyone who's listening, if they're wanting to connect with you, how best can they do that?
Well, I'm on LinkedIn, right? And then also, so have a website, which is www hopeharvesting.com, and by email as well. That's Latise at hopeharvesting.com. We're doing some things that are going to be rolling out. We do something that's called Women Heal and Rise, and it's just for BIPOC women. It's a 6-week experience within a collective experience where we are in this process of healing together and celebrating each other. I mean, really looking at, what are the things that have harmed us, but also looking at our strengths, what are historical ways and practices, right? That also live in our DNA, right? And so, yeah, it's a beautiful experience together. So, yes, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here and to talk to you, and really all the amazing work that you're doing and giving voice, right, to when we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, because it's all of us doing the work together that makes a difference in terms of like the principle of 7 generations, right? What do we do today that's going to impact the next 7 generations to come?
Yeah.
And you're doing amazing work toward that.
Oh, thank you so much, Latise. And yeah, I mean, this is why I do this work. It's definitely for future generations, and I will definitely be linking down below all of your links to your social LinkedIn profile, as well as your website and email as well. So if anyone's listening and wanting to reach out to Latise, you can definitely do that. Just check out the description below, and also take a look at her website as well for the event that she's just spoken about, because it sounds amazing. So you definitely don't want to miss that.